Over the past 27 years, there have been 9 generations of main series Pokemon games released and over 1,000 Pokemon created. But which one of those is the best? Well, it's Eternamax Eternatus. No other Pokemon comes even close to those stats. Eternamax Eternatus isn't actually obtainable without cheating though, so that can't be it. Actually, legendary Pokemon in general are by design much better than the normal ones. So to rephrase this question, what is the best Pokemon in each game that could be realistically obtained through normal gameplay? This is a tough question to answer objectively. Smogon ranks Pokemon based on their own tiers, so the answer would just be whatever is used the most in the highest tier, right? Wrong. Smogon's tiers are based primarily on usage in a metagame. If a large amount of people decided that they wanted to use Goldeen in the Anything Goes tier, Goldeen could become the best Pokemon according to Smogon. To answer this question, I had to make my own spreadsheet and ranking system. In most Pokemon games, there are 4 categories that could be used to affect a Pokemon's power in battle. These are stats, type, moves, and abilities. Abilities aren't present in Generations 1 and 2, so they will have no impact on the final rankings in those games. To rank each of the stats, I had to make my own point system for each of them. Base stats were easy to figure out, as they already have a defined number attached to them. Types were similarly easy to make a system for, since each type has a specific set of matchups against every other type. The hardest ones to rank were moves and abilities. These don't have a specific value assigned to their viability, so I had to get a bit creative. For abilities, I decided to give each ability a point if I considered it to be useful on the Pokemon that has it, no points if it didn't affect it very much, and took away points for each ability that actively made it worse. In rare cases, I gave 2 points to an ability that defined a Pokemon's entire use, such as Pure Power on Medicham. With this, all I had left to figure out was how to rank the moves. After talking to a friend of mine who was interested in the project, we came up with the idea of ranking moves by the total number of moves considered useful by Smogon, and those same useful moves, but counting all attacking moves of the same type and category as a single useful move. We also came up with the idea of dividing each score by the average of its category. I would then multiply this number by 50 to get the final score, with the score of 50 being the most average Pokemon. This seemed to be a great idea at the time, but it turned out to be a bit of a curse, which I'll get to later on. Making the ranking system was the easiest part of this project. I didn't mention this yet since it would break the flow of the video, but I had to get all of this data from somewhere. Luckily for me, Bulbapedia and Cerebi are great resources for gathering this data. There's a small problem with this though, and this brings me to my first major mistake. Priorities. Since I had so much information available, I thought of a secondary goal for the spreadsheet I was making. As far as I know, there isn't a spreadsheet available online with a comprehensive list of data for every Pokemon, and I wanted to be the first person to finally make this. This resulted in me wasting a lot of time on inputting data that was not needed to answer my original question. Because of that mistake, I have unfortunately made the decision to limit my results to the first 4 generations of games. Once the data inputting was completed, I could move on to the math section of the spreadsheet. I wanted to make it so that I could easily input a Pokemon's name and have all the data for it show up on the sheet for each individual game. That would make the sheet usable for any of the games. I've never experimented with any form of coding before, so this was a challenge for me. But with a few YouTube tutorials, Google searches, and desperate messages to friends who know way more about this than I do, I was able to finish the code that could analyze and rank all of the Pokemon's data for me. This is where my second mistake was made, and it all had to do with what I thought was a great idea at first, but ended up disrupting the balancing of the categories quite a bit. Not every Pokemon is created equally. Some of them excel in only one aspect, some are overall good but don't shine in any specific way, and some have the stats of an actual god, but I already made that joke in the intro. The problem with dividing each category by its average is that it doesn't limit the maximum value of any category. This makes it heavily favor Pokemon that excel in one category, and doesn't affect the areas where they may not be as good nearly as much. Now that I've explained my process and the mistakes I made while executing it, I can move on to the final rankings. I made a ranking sheet for each game from generations 1 to 4 since the Pokemon availability is slightly different between games. In all 3 of Pokemon Red, Blue, and Yellow versions, Dragonite is the Pokemon that came out on top. Starmie was a very close second though. Of these games, Dragonite has the highest score in Red version with 70.61 points. These are probably the most balanced of all the games, as the only Pokemon that excels at anything actually excels at how bad it can possibly be. Ditto is a Pokemon with the gimmick of its only move being Transform, which changes it into a copy of the Pokemon it is currently battling. It has really low base stats, and since it's a normal type, which is one of the worst types in terms of effectiveness against other types, it's no wonder that Ditto only scored 26.69 points at its absolute worst in Yellow version. In Pokemon Gold, Silver, and Crystal versions, we can see a great example of a Pokemon that took advantage of a single category while being bad in the rest of them. Smeargle is an otherwise terrible Pokemon whose only redeeming quality is that it gets access to almost every single move in the game. This gave it a move score of 168 points, which was brought down a lot in the final score that took every category into account, but it still came out on top with a final score of 81 points at its best performance in Silver version. Unsurprisingly, Ditto is still at the very bottom of the ranking, but is joined at the bottom by two other gimmick Pokemon: Wobbuffet, who can only counter opponents' attacks, and Unknown, whose only move is one that changes type and power based on its stats. Generation 3 brings in the ability category, which adds another layer of complexity to the rankings. In Pokemon Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald versions, the best Pokemon is Alakazam, with 63.27 points at its best in Ruby version. The only reason why Smeargle isn't in the top position is because it can't be found in the games at all. Another new concept in Generation 3 is remakes of past Pokemon games. Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green versions are remakes of the Generation 1 games with updated mechanics from Generation 3. This doesn't change the results seen in Generation 1 though. Dragonite is still the best Pokemon with a score of 67.11 points at its best in Fire Red version. Generation 4 added changes that made movesets even better, but that isn't a huge issue yet. Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum versions are also the first games that have a different best Pokemon depending on the game. In Diamond and Pearl, the best Pokemon is Blissey, with 64.29 points at its best in Pearl version. In Platinum, however, the best Pokemon is Togekiss, with 63.31 points thanks to the expanded availability of Pokemon in that game. Generation 4 also had remakes of previous games, these being Pokemon Heart Gold and Soul Silver versions. If you were expecting Smeargle to be in any position other than the top in these games, the moveset changes in Generation 4 mean that Smeargle is even more dominant. Smeargle has a whopping 83.76 points at its best in Heart Gold version, beating the second place Dragonite by almost 20 points. So to answer the question of what the best Pokemon is, from Generations 1 to 4 it seems like the answer is Smeargle in Heart Gold version. I'm not entirely satisfied with this answer since the categories were not balanced very well, but unfortunately I just didn't have the time to change all of the math to something more balanced. This is definitely a project I want to revisit and complete in the future, but for now, that's all from me. Thanks for watching.